And it's so important because the resurrection is what convinced the early believers that Jesus was who he said he was. It was the resurrection that led them to a place to say, okay, Jesus said he was the Messiah, then he must be the Messiah. He said that he was the Son of God. It must mean that it's true. He is the Son of God. The resurrection is what confirmed all this, that Jesus was God in a bod. It wasn't his teaching that convinced people. It wasn't his miracles that convinced people. It was the resurrection. And it's still convincing people today. But listen, let's back up a little bit. We don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead just because the Bible tells us so. No, it's way, way, way bigger than that. It's way, way, way better than that. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead because a first century follower of his, a Jewish man named Matthew, who was a tax collector of all things, followed Jesus and wrote about his life and wrote about his death and wrote about his resurrection. That's why we believe. We believe that a Greek named Mark, who was a friend of the Apostle Peter, Mark followed Peter around and heard Peter tell his story as an eyewitness of the death and resurrection of Jesus. That Mark wrote out that story, believing what Peter believed. We believe in the resurrection because a doctor named Luke, who was also a Greek, he followed Paul around the Mediterranean, but Luke also kind of functioned as an investigative journalist. He interviewed everybody that he could find in the time that he had who had encountered Jesus, who had heard Jesus, who had seen Jesus resurrected afterwards, and he wrote out what we call the Gospel of Luke. And we also believe because the Apostle Peter is an eyewitness, he left us 2 letters behind that he wrote to the early church that talked about Jesus rising from the dead. And we believe that Jesus rose from the dead because, and this is my favorite, because James, the brother of Jesus, concluded that his older brother was his Lord. Now, what would it take? What would your brother have to do to convince you that he was your Lord? Exactly. I have an older brother. It would be very, very hard. But James, while Jesus was alive, James was not impressed by Jesus' sermons. James was not impressed by Jesus' miracles. James looked at his brother as his Lord when he saw the resurrection. See, these are ordinary people, but extraordinary people in some ways. They're brave people who documented what they saw and what they heard from others who had seen the resurrected Jesus. And then those documents were collected, those documents were protected, and eventually they were combined into a volume that we call the New Testament. But long before there was a Bible, there were men and women who were eyewitnesses of the resurrection. It was the resurrection that changed everything. And the people who were closest to Jesus were excruciatingly honest. In fact, this is one of the reasons why you should take their account seriously. The people who wrote about their experience of Jesus, they didn't write themselves in as heroes. They wrote themselves into the story as doubters. All of them doubted. Listen, they expected Jesus to do what all dead people do. What is it that all dead people do? They stay dead. And Andy Stanley puts it this way. I love this. He said, nobody expected nobody. Everybody who loved and was devoted to Jesus figured that once they saw him buried, he was gone for good. When Jesus was killed, not only did they kind of change their lives, but they had to think that everything Jesus said was a lie. Because Jesus called himself, he said, I'm the light of the world. You can't crucify the light of the world. He said, I'm the resurrection and the life. That's what he said about himself. You can't kill the resurrection and the life, can you? They must have assumed that everything he said was not true. The other person that was an eyewitness and follower of Jesus who gives us his account is John. And John was a witness of both the crucifixion and the resurrection. And he details both for us. But like the other followers of Jesus, John did not expect a crucifixion, didn't see that coming, and he certainly did not expect and see a resurrection coming. What John expected is what all the other disciples expected, and that was that at some point Jesus would rip off his disguise as a Jewish peasant and reveal himself as a king. The king who would take the occupying Roman force and kick them out in an act of war and violence. That's what they expected Jesus to do and be. And Jesus had this knack for knowing what they were thinking. And at the Last Supper, they're at this meal together, right? The Last Supper, it's a Passover meal. Jesus knows what they're thinking. And so instead of creating a battle plan, Jesus says, all right, are you guys listening? Are you guys listening? Here's my new commandment. Here's what I want the future to look like. And he tells them simply this, John 13:34, love one another. That's your plan, Jesus? Yeah. No, it gets better. Love one another. Just as I have loved you, you must love one another. And the subtext here is, don't love others the way you've been loved, because that could have been a very imperfect love. Don't love others the way you want to be loved, because that can also be a very imperfect love. I want you to love others the way I have loved you. And then the next day, he would give them a demonstration of love that would blow their minds.